Go ahead, Leah.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Law and Society Honor Society of Speaker Series. Today, we are honored to have Mr. Rahman and Diverse Force to speak with us about the power of diversity and inclusion within the workforce. We will discuss the advantages and impacts of diversity and how we can use inclusion within companies to increase retention, performance, and overall foster a warm and welcoming environment, and use our diversity as an advantage in our future professions. We will begin with opening remarks and leave time towards the end for any comments or any questions. And with that, I hand it over.
All right, well, Leah, it's a pleasure to be here and to join you all on this, I think, important conversation. I was having a little bit of conversation with Professor Lane before this, and thinking about obviously in 2020, there's been a lot of performative actions around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and not really maybe understanding the importance and the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how it helps organizations to grow. There's a lot of important research around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and why organizations with the seismic demographic shifts that are happening in our country, that companies make sure that they diversify their staff, they diversify their board. A little bit about my background. I'm actually born, raised, and stayed here in Philadelphia. I went to University of Pennsylvania undergrad for engineering and entrepreneurship. And over the last 20 plus years, I've built networks of Black and brown professionals. I started a website called urbanphilly.com, which was basically a way to get some of the students who came into Philadelphia, which we had this big brain drain issue, which a lot of folks who come to school here, they stay in their bubble, whether it be at Jefferson or University of Pennsylvania or Temple, and then they leave the city. And where our platform was a way for people to start integrating into the city, into the arts and culture experiences, into the nonprofits, giving back in meaningful ways. And that evolved into UPPN, the Urban Philly Professional Network, which again is focused on engaging, empowering, and connecting the next generation of business and civic leaders. So engaging them in community and civic involvement, empower them to advance their careers and grow their businesses, and to connect with others who share similar interests. And that started me into being requested to serve on boards in the Philadelphia area, nonprofit boards. I started serving on a board for the African American Chamber of Commerce here in Philadelphia. About a year later, I was elected to chair the board. So I was, 32 years old and chairing the board for an important institution here in the city. And that really introduced me to a lot of city council and the mayor of Philadelphia at the time, and which is Mayor Nutter, and other kind of leaders throughout the region. The mayor appointed me to serve on the board for PIDC, which is a kind of an economic engine for the city as well, around financing capital for some of the biggest projects. And since then, I've served on a dozen different boards. Mastery Charter Schools, which has over 25 schools in the region. K through 12, Community College of Philadelphia Foundation. I vice chair that board. The Linfest Institute, which owns the Philadelphia Inquirer here. So I've had a chance to kind of, sit on many different boards and see the impact of being able to have diverse talent within organizations, to have diverse leadership within organizations, and also the challenges that many organizations find themselves in as far as diversifying. And since then, we started a program, we started Diverse Force in 2017 for that exact issue, because many organizations, although many times they have frontline employees or a lot of consumers who are diverse, their leadership lack diversity. And I would say diversity dies in the middle of the organization around those leadership roles, and definitely tapers off as you get to the top of the organization. So Diverse Force is really focused on helping to make sure that organizations can diversify their talent at the top of the organization. And we started a program in partnership with University of Pennsylvania called Diverse Force on Boards. It's a 6-month board training program for professionals of colors to go through a 6-month kind of governance, leadership, and DEI training. And then we place them on nonprofit boards throughout the region. And since then, since 2017, we've actually filled 120 board seats for nonprofit organizations all throughout the region, ranging from $250,000 budgets to up to $500 million budgets, with organizations like PHMC and, the Kimmel Centers and, these different organizations throughout the region. So that's the work we've done. And I think a lot of the CEOs and executives do understand the importance of diversity with, again, our employee base soon being 75% of our employee base by 2025 will be millennials and Generation Z. And the demographic of that population, 45% of millennials are people of color. 51% of Generation Z are people of color. So leadership understands that if you're going to tap into these emerging markets, if you're going to recruit talent, you can't build a successful business with half the population. You're missing out on a ton of important talent. And many times a lot of blind spots that happen within organizations because they just don't understand the lived experiences when they have homogeneous organizations. So a lot of work is going around unconscious bias. And when I talk to a lot of groups, I use an exercise to help them understand, just how sometimes bias our brains or just not how imperfect our brains can be sometimes and cause us to miss opportunities. And I'll use I'll do a couple examples here. I'll do one of the examples here and see if you guys can participate with me. So I'll ask you guys 2 questions. Now, some of you may be younger, but if you could just by a raise of hand, who actually has their driver's license? If you could raise your hand. Yeah, we drive. Okay, perfect. Okay, everyone has a driver's license. So you've taken the test. You're a proficient driver. I'm going to ask you 2 simple questions. It's not and I'll just ask you to use your chat. Okay, use your chat, and I'll read them off. But the first question is, what color is a stop sign? You just go ahead and drop in the chat. What color is a stop sign? So, Professor Lane says red, Leah red, Christina red, Alejandra red, Meredith red and white, red. Okay, so we have a consensus pretty much is red or red and white. Okay, second question is, what color is a yield sign? Go ahead and drop in there. What color is a yield sign? Okay, Professor Lane, yellow, 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 yellow. Okay, everyone says yellow. Now, interesting fact. Yield signs have not been yellow and black since 1971.
Get out of here.
Yield signs are actually red and white. And for some reason, we still believe that they're yellow. In fact, I asked my daughter, she was 8 years old. I asked her about 4 years ago. Yeah, 4 years ago, I asked her, I said, sweetheart, what color is a yield sign? And she said yellow and black. And I heard this example back in 2006. I said the same thing, yellow and black. And then I was in New Orleans and they said, no, it's red. And I said, no, not in Philadelphia. They're still yellow in Philadelphia. Got back to Philadelphia and that was exactly what the situation was. It was actually red. And so I asked my daughter, I said, what color is the yield sign? She said, it's yellow and black. And I said, you see that sign across the street? She said, yeah. I said, what color is it? She said, red and white. So what kind of sign is it? It's a yield sign. I said, then why did you say yellow? She said, well, my teacher said it was yellow. I said, interesting. So we're actually passing down wrong information from generation to generation. And this kind of persistence of thought, this first thing that comes into our mind, and we just continue to see it the same way. And it reminds me of the little girl who goes to her mom and says, Mom, why is it that, during the holidays when you make the roast, you cut the end of the roast before you put it in the oven? And her mom says, you know what? I'm not sure. My mother used to do it. Ask your grandma. So she went to her grandma and said, Grandma, why is it that every year, during the holidays, you cut the end of the roast before you put it in the oven? And her grandmom thought, say, you know what? I'm not sure. My mother should do it. Ask your great grandma. Went to her great grandma, asked her the same question. And her great grandmom said, sweetheart, I don't cut the end of the roast. So wait a minute. Grandma said when she was younger, you cut the end of the roast, and she did it when my mom was young, and we still do it today. She said, oh yeah, back then I had a small pan and the roast didn't fit. So I had to cut the end of the roast. Said, but since then I got a bigger pan. I get my whole roast. And the question is, how many of us are cutting the ends off on life, on impact, on so many things based on someone else's old small pan? And many times you need a fresh perspective, a different look on things, and just realizing that many times we have these blind spots, but we can open our lens by including different perspectives and different And many times when I do that example, people are from different countries. They're like, oh, it's red and white. Like, it's pretty straightforward because they're paying attention differently. So it's so important to recognize that we do have blind spots, that there's things that we may think are just certain. And we teach this a lot on boards to encourage constructive conflict. Many times there's this, people feel like harmony is a good thing, like everyone thinks the same way, these echo chambers. But many times we don't have accuracy of solutions when we don't have that diversity of perspective and thought and have a psychological safety to say, no, I see it this way. Let's talk about it. Let's stress test these ideas and have constructive conflict around ideas, not conflict. Destructive conflict is when we have conflict with people, but we can have conflict around ideas and stress test them amongst each other, and we'll have better decision making going forward when we create the right culture and the right environment where we can have those different lived experiences, perspectives, and many times that comes in the form of gender, race, ethnicity, cultural backgrounds, different lived experiences. And when you have that mosaic of perspective, you can actually tap into more and have a wider lens in which you can actually be more innovative, more creative, tap into more talent, attract more people, and more, for nonprofit organizations. I shared an example of me serving on the board for the Community College of Philadelphia. A friend of mine, he's a fraternity brother. His name is Malcolm Jenkins. If you follow football, you probably know the name. He actually asked him to serve on the board with me at the community college, and he joined the board with me. And we've been trying to get Kevin Hart, who's an alumni of CCP for years. They're like, hey, we're trying to get to his manager, and we're in the board meeting saying we haven't heard anything back. Been trying to connect with them, and Malcolm said, oh, I just texted him, and he told me he'll call me later and let me know if he can do the event. So tapping into new networks. We have a pastor who actually serves on the board, who's the chair of the board, and most of the boards I've served on, that they don't have a pastor or anyone who. She's actually a first lady at the church, and for Enon Baptist Church out in the Mount Airy area. And during Easter, they usually do a fundraiser where they'll have two organizations kind of share about the organization. And they had CCP, actually, our president, Dr. Guy Generals, talk about CCP. And in 15 minutes, we raised $100,000 in 15 minutes from individual giving from the church, which is very powerful. A lot of the parishioners who are there, either their children or family members have benefited from from CCP, but no one ever asked them to give. So you think about fundraising and activities like that, tapping into new donors, and when you have a diverse board, when you have diversity of programming that's tapping into the needs of your community. So those are just a few examples of how diversity, whether it be occupation, racial background, gender background, so many ways that you can make organizations better when it's done right and there's a strong culture behind it as well. So I'll pause there, and any questions you guys have, love to delve into it.
I have a question, especially in light of current conflict. I mean, you make a terrific argument for the value of diversity, but you have people who have frightened by it, who hold on power issues and fear that they're losing their place in society when they're sharing their country, their board, their company, their school class, whatever it may be, with people who don't look like them. How do you deal with that pushback?
Yeah. And there is a paradigm for some folks that is a zero-sum game. If this group wins, then I lose, if you will. But the pie is much bigger. We can build a bigger pie. And the reality is, our country, the U.S., has lost so much in our GDP as a result of half the population not being engaged and having living wages, and 25% poverty in the city. So how do we, in our city and poverty in our country? So how do we empower communities that have been left behind or underrepresented to stimulate the economy, to create more opportunities, build bigger. So I think it's a paradigm shift to recognize it's not a zero-sum game, that we can empower new communities, tap into more opportunities, and grow the pie versus fight over small pieces of it. But that is a philosophy change, and folks have to embrace that as well.
I have a lot of questions, but I don't want to hog it from the students. Does any students or other participants have questions before I go on the litany of questions that I have? All right, I will interfere again. What is the reality out there? I know you're fighting to bring diversity to all these corporations. What is the reality as far as major people in corporations, diversity? We know Congress, we know the Senate is not reflective of what the country really is, gender or race-wise. What are you seeing out there as far as these corporations you're dealing with, the major board members? Just how white are they?
Yeah. I can speak for the nonprofit sector. Board Source did a study in 2017 called Leading with Intent, and a diversity on boards and executive leadership in the nonprofit sector, which serves a very diverse audience. Obviously, 84% of board leaders and executives are white. Only 16% are people of color, and these are many organizations that are serving communities of color, majority communities of color in many cases, and the mean, versus the average is actually 96% white, which kind of weeds out the extremes on each side. So there's a lot of work that needs to happen. There's been a culture of kind of this social capital, where people at the top tend to, at these organizations on boards, they tend to invite people that look like them. It's natural to invite people that you like, you trust, and we tend to attract and in a dominant white society and leadership, we're going to continue to perpetuate those things unless we're very intentional about inclusion. I know there's a lot of training around unconscious bias, and it's one thing to take your bias from being unconscious to then conscious. All right, it's another thing to then be consciously inclusive and then become unconsciously inclusive when you do it long enough. So it does require work to be consciously inclusive. It may take longer, but you sometimes have to slow down to speed up in certain circumstances. And some people, just want to do things that, kind of we talked about before, the cutting the end off on life, or cutting off the end off on the roast, when you can actually get the whole roast by slowing down, create new habits, and go against some of those unconscious or conscious biases that keep us from diversifying and having a bigger pie, if you will, or a bigger roast. So that's and overall, I think that from a business perspective, many organizations do see that the leadership understands the importance of diversity, because again, just the numbers of it, for those who are visionaries and forward thinking, that it's unsustainable to only tap into a fraction of the community or market that you want to tap into. I serve on a board for the Kimmel Center, here in Philadelphia, and the audience is getting white, is very white and white hair, so you need to get a younger audience, a more diverse audience, more reflective of the population, or we won't sustain, the organization will die. So it's important that we tap and understand where the market's going, and also retaining talent, attracting talent, getting support, as organizations and major corporations are recognizing that they have to be ESG aligned. It's a new terminology that's going to become very popular, environmentally, socially, and governance, as far as responsibility. And the capital markets are being influenced by whether they're ESG aligned. So there's certain metrics that they need to put in place in order for capital to flow their way. Major investment institutions like BlackRock and Goldman Sachs, and these are now saying, hey, unless you're ESG aligned, we know that ESG aligned organizations perform better for our shareholders. So there's a lot of risk around not being diverse, reputational risk, blind spots, all kinds of things. So again, there's a lot of research and understanding around diversity organizations that are diverse just outperform those that are not diverse, especially in this environment of social media, this environment of risk, reputational risk. So it's really important to do so. So I'll take a couple questions. I think that was Ben. Was that your hand up first, or was that Meredith?
Go ahead, Ben.
Someone's on that.
Yes, I do have a question. So my question, if I'm understanding correctly, a lot of what you've been talking about is how to get people on the other end, the ones hiring, to be more inclusive and more diverse. However, from the opposite, you were talking about, things that have just been passed down from generation to generation without real any explanation, and people just kind of fall into old habits. So I want to know, how would you suggest encouraging people to apply for jobs and positions and fields that they originally thought were not fit for them just because of ingrained biases? Because
Yeah.
I think, especially for people of color and Black people in general, there have been fields that we have over time just been systematically excluded from, and now it's kind of ingrained in us that we are not fit for those roles. So what would you suggest are some tactics for getting people to see themselves in a new light and to step out? Because the worst you can do is apply and get rejected, right?
Yeah.
But I feel
Yeah.
like people aren't even applying for those positions, if you understand
Yeah.
what I'm saying.
Yeah, it's a really great point, Ben. I use the analogy of the pikefish, if you will. There's a study, a pikefish study, where they show there's a pikefish that feeds on minnows, and they have the pikefish in this aquarium, and there's fish in the aquarium. The pikefish is eating the fish, and then in this study, they put a partition between the pikefish and the minnows. And now the pikefish cannot get to the minnows. It's hitting his head, it's hitting his head, it's hitting his head. And then they eventually remove the partition from the pikefish and the minnows, and the pikefish still doesn't even try to go after the minnows. And the pikefish ends up dying from starvation. Now, not to say that these barriers are not there in many cases, but in some cases, those barriers may have been removed, and there's more opportunities for diversity in these spaces. So I encourage folks to go after it. Don't lose your enthusiasm. I would say go from failure to failure with the same level of enthusiasm, because again, persistence many times and believing in yourself is where it all starts. And again, there'll always be societal barriers. There'll always be things that will potentially slow us down or try to hinder folks. But from a perspective of, as an entrepreneur myself and someone who's had to kind of control, only thing I can control is what I believe. And, and that's where, from an individual perspective, encouraging people to believe in yourself, to understand the value that you bring to the table, and to risk being rejected in many cases. But you'll be surprised in many cases, the barriers that we've created in our mind are much bigger than what they are in reality. So again, I don't want to dismiss the fact that there are sometimes you do have to jump higher, you have to run faster. And I know that you guys had a conversation around kind of code switching before, and although it does feel like a burden or a liability, I like to asset frame it and call it cultural agility. You have an asset that you've learned to be culturally agile, that you can adjust to different environments and connect and have that. I have a friend who went to Penn with me, and she worked at Google early on. They had a great opportunity for her to lead in India. And she could have said, well, no one's going to follow me. I don't really understand the culture there. But she decided to have the cultural agility and learn what the culture was there to lead in India, which led her to other opportunities. She ended up being the CEO of TaskRabbit, which is an awesome gig economy company. Her name is Stacy Philpott Brown. And, she sold that company to IKEA. She serves on boards, first, Black woman to serve on different boards like Nordstrom and HP and different firms that pay over $500,000 each to serve on their board. And she's a pioneer in the Silicon Valley market. And because she believed in herself and chose to be culturally agile, she's able to open up opportunities for so many other people. So I encourage you all to as leaders, obviously recognize that there may be some barriers, but to go after it anyway. And you'll be surprised that, you can break through some of those barriers or overcome them as well.
Meredith.
Hi, yeah, so I was just wondering, I'm thinking about some institutions that I guess I'm thinking about ballet in particular, but just some institutions that are trying to increase their diversity. And I'm just wondering if like increasing the numbers is enough when some of these institutions are just like bogged down by these non-diverse like origins and stuff, like institutions that are so like European, or like is the visibility of like people of color, diverse people, like enough to create the change that we need, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree, man. And that's why we do the work that we do. I believe diversity starts in the boardroom, where policies and generative thinking and strategy can start. At that level is where you can really start asking the questions about mission, vision, core values, all those things. So I believe that it starts in the boardroom, to start uprooting some of that kind of white supremacist kind of approach to, or European approach to everything. So there's opportunities to start at the top of the organization where you can truly have institutional change. And that's why I always tell those who go through our program that no one who's going through this program needs a training to serve on a board, because I didn't have a training to serve on a board. Most people who serve on nonprofit boards, they don't get training to serve on a board, unfortunately. So I say everyone should have the right to serve on a board at the same level of incompetence as everyone else. But the reality is, we don't want just Black and brown faces in high places. We want to make sure that their presence is felt, that they can bring a different perspective to uproot and some of the things that are making the organizations again not get their whole roast, if you will, and truly be able to be sustainable, to tap into new markets, to challenge some of our beliefs, and to do things differently than they've been done in the past. Because again, there's a whole different market, it's a whole different environment. So that kind of generative thinking and strategy needs to happen at the top of the organization. And that burden can't, many times it's not going to happen from just hiring a few people that are in the same systems and policies that have perpetuated the same issues for many, many years. So that's a great point that you make there.
I have a question, something we discussed before we went on the air, but I've seen a lot of corporations do what I call window dressing. They may in their commercials, oh, we respect Black Lives Matter, or something that's just thrown out there from a PR point of view. How much have you seen is from a PR point of view in hiring or bringing people into the board, as opposed to a real attempt to change ways of thinking?
Yeah. It's hard sometimes, Professor Lane, to know intent. You can same action with the wrong intent can lead to failed efforts. That's where terms like performative, DEI and tokenism, takes root, where people are just doing it for the brand, if you will. We try to show organizations how they can be and do DEI versus just trying to be perceived as diverse, equitable, and inclusive. And we have domains of DEI that are far beyond just your marketing and branding. It goes down to how diverse is your leadership in your board. How is your procurement, your supplier diversity? Are you hiring? How's your talent management and hiring practices? Your investment, your community engagement and advocacy that's happening. So there's a lot more than just hiring people of color, but making sure that you're actually being diverse, equitable, and inclusive as well. And that's where also boards have the opportunity to have kind of KPIs, key performance indicators, that can give some signs, some lead indicators and lag indicators of lack of inclusion, some of these more intangible things like how people feel. You know, diversity is what we see, inclusion is how people feel. So some of the qualitative data as well, that's important to understand organizational culture, psychological safety within the organization, opportunities for promotion and advancement. So some of these really tangible things that are signs of a diverse, equitable, and inclusive organization need to happen again at the top of the organization. The board has one employee, and that's the CEO or executive director of the organization, and holding them accountable to metrics, and them then holding their team and their leadership to those metrics as well. So absolutely, you know, I always say that DEI has become pop culture, you know, since May 2020, and a lot of people are going through the motions, but are not aligned, you know, principally aligning those values and living those values throughout their organization. And there's some tangible things that organizations can do to actually live those values versus just promote them and advertise them.
Leah?
Have you seen any increase in diversity in terms of like people with disabilities, whether it be physical or mental? And then like in terms of like physical, a lot of companies or buildings do not have the access for any like wheelchairs or anything of that nature. So have you seen any increase in trying to give people the opportunity to be on boards, even if they are like disabled mentally or physically?
Yeah, it's a great question, Leah. One, there's a lot of intersectionality, you know, amongst some of those domains of dimensions of diversity as well. So you have people from all different races and genders who also may have physical abilities or disabilities, folks who have, you know, kind of neurodiversity. And that has not been a sector that I've tapped into most or been as engaged in, but there are organizations and institutions, nonprofit organizations that are advancing for the blind and visibly impaired, for neurodiversity, you know, those who are on the spectrum like autism and things of that sort, where, you know, what are some of the jobs that they can do really well at, in some cases even better than, you know, than some of the talent that are in the sector now. So finding some of the strengths of some of the different neurodiversity and things of that sort. So there is a number of organizations that are doing that work, and hopefully it continues to emerge as we're thinking about being more diverse, equitable, and inclusive, that we think about all the different dimensions of diversity to make sure that we're tapping into an opportunity to have a broader spectrum of talent. Because, you know, even with this pandemic, we're seeing a lot of people who are becoming psychologically unemployable. They're starting their own jobs. I mean, their own businesses. Many people don't want to go back into the workforce. So the labor market has, although there's a lot of unemployment, a lot of folks are not looking to go back to the workplace as well. So you have to tap into a larger pool of talent to make sure that that companies can continue to grow, and talent's becoming a really important piece of that puzzle. So being creative about how to be inclusive and equitable, not because you're doing it out of the goodness of your heart, but to be able to truly drive this economy with good talent as well.
I'd like to build, I think it was Benny who brought up the question, but the effect on the people who have been put to a lower end by representation. Going back, Brown versus Board of Education, one of the classic studies was the doll study, where young children of color looked at a doll, and they always chose, usually chose the white doll over the black doll, and the evidence is that they believed the black doll was not attractive and the white doll was, because they've been told that subconsciously. And I think a similar thing does apply, building on what Benny said, is that people who have been told they're not worthy, been told they're not as valuable, no matter how untrue that is, get that in their head. And I want to know, have you faced that in dealing with people and trying to place them? where because of these pressures that they have faced their whole lives growing up, that they don't think they're as talented or as worthy as you know they are.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I share my own story around that. I was born in Germantown, but my mother very early wanted to move me out of the neighborhood and low income neighborhood that we were in back in the 70s. She took advantage of a program that allowed her to work for the city of Philadelphia and moved out to Northeast Philadelphia, which is a predominantly white area of the city at the time. So for me, I grew up and I was conscious of race very early, being in a community that didn't look like me. And my mother shared with me a moment where I was about 4 or 5 years old, and it was Halloween. And, she had candy and kids were coming to the door to trick or treat. I was in my Batman outfit at 4 or 5 years old. That was my favorite superhero. And a white kid, came to the door, innocent little white boy came to the door about the same age as me. And he had the same outfit on that I had. And my mother shared how how I ran to the corner of the house and was crying. I was bawling. I was crying. And after she gave the candy, she went and came over and said, "Sweetheart, what's wrong? Why are you crying?" And I said, "He's the real Batman." And she said, "Why?" I said, "Because he's white, like Batman. He's the real Batman." And at that moment, she realized that I was dealing with some of that at such a young age and being conscious of race. So she started to really start to instill in me, Black pride and, and things and showing images that may not be as natural in the environment if you're not intentional about it. And we have to understand that, our society, unfortunately, we look at the yield sign, we're still have some remnants of some of those biases and things that are still in our brain passed down from generations. Think about how, it wasn't too long ago, actually Martin Luther King was assassinated, 8 years before I was born. I was born in 1976. So it's not as far back as we think. And unfortunately, our society, had to dehumanize African Americans in order for people to accept their place, if you will, as slaves and those things. So it's been a strategic, way of dehumanizing people. And to this day, we still have media and stereotypes that folks have to face. We're all subject to it. So we're subject to the same stereotypes that media has portrayed our community. So it's a fight sometimes in our own minds, even being Black and brown, to not catch some of that psychological perspective that has been portrayed towards us. And as a young child, obviously in your most receptive stages, those images, like going back and forth from my mother's house. I'm in a white neighborhood where it's clean, houses are nice. I go to the Black, quote unquote, Black neighborhood, and the houses are run down. It's poverty, it's all these things. And all I see is white neighborhood, nice, Black neighborhood, bad, and crime and infested. Not knowing about FHA and some of the historical things that have created these neighborhoods that were divested from and jobs taken out of and mass incarceration, all the political and policy that have created these circumstances. But as a young kid, I'm just seeing white, Black, good, bad, and those things can materialize in our lives and how we play out. So absolutely, those things play out as far as imposter syndrome and all kinds of things that if we're not very conscious of that and start to reinforce our belief systems in ways that override some of that programming, you're going to see some of the natural implications of that as well.
Really interesting answer. Thank you. Does anyone else have any more questions? Well, then it's a very good opportunity. Thank you so much. I will, since we're being recorded, I will press you for internships for my students, because this sounds like a great thing to be involved in, and you're doing such good work. Thank you so much for helping us out today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for the great questions as well. Glad to be here.
Bye-bye now.